Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com emailing address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who has asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's question is with regards to a topic which I suspect many people would like to know about. And I've only ever received one question on this particular topic, and that is surnames. It goes like this. Dear Mr. Soup, I have a friend who claims they are of Viking stock because their surname is Borg. Apparently, much to my surprise, this is not only the name of a maniacal mechanical species in Star Trek, but also a Swedish name. Is this the case? Are our surnames the key to understanding our ancient origins? I'm a big fan of your videos. Keep it up, Mandy. Thank you very much, Mandy. Well, Mandy, you ask a fascinating question, and a question which I would love to answer, so I'm going to do so. But I'd like to start out with a small caveat, and that is to say, if you have particularly strong feelings about your family origins and your surname, and you're absolutely certain of a central truism to your identity, please turn off the video now, because I'm not here to have an argument. I'm here simply to discuss the phenomenon of surnames, so please be nice if you're going to comment below. Let's begin. So, first of all, Mandy, the surname. What is the surname? Well, the origin of the word surname actually is in Old French. It comes from the 1300s or thereabouts, and it's linked with the concept of being above or an over name. So it's a name which is above your first name, your surname. And it's a concept which is very much linked, in Britain at least, with the Norman conquest. Now, I'm going to be sticking to predominantly English-speaking or Northern European surname traditions. Family names across the world have many different traditions and quirks linked with them and their formation. But for this particular question, I'm going to stick with our part of the world, as it were. Now, what this means, though, and unfortunately what this should hopefully be an instant sort of red flag, as it were, is that surnames have, as a concept, they have a starting point, and that is typically with the formation of sort of proto-states and the beginnings of taxation and this kind of thing, the need for individual nomenclature to actually tie you down as a person, and go from there. Anyway. Surnames, when they started to be formed, they can come from several different origins. Some are older than others, and some point to previous traditions. So, for example, first of all, one of the oldest traditions in terms of surnames is a given name. So a name which is linked with my father. So, for example, Benson would be an excellent example, son of Ben. Other examples from other countries in Northern Europe include, for example, Mac in Scotland, meaning son of, Muck in Ireland, meaning son of, Ap in Wales, meaning son of. For example, Pritchard is an abbreviation of Ap Richard, son of Richard. And so on and so forth. Now, these patronymic, meaning of one's father, paternal, or matronymic, meaning of one's mother, maternal. An example of that would be Megson, in fact, but they're much less common than matronymic names. Are some of the oldest surnames around. So they are given names. They are names linked with either a literal or a perceived ancestor. For example, a clan identity may well come from a perceived common ancestor. An occupational name, that's another common early name, but not as early as others. For example, Vickers may be linked with one's an ancestor who was once a vicar, for example. I once knew of someone called Bishop who thought that they were of a Bishop family, but in fact actually they were just from Bishop Auckland in the north of England. Also things like, for example, I once knew a family called Brewer, who supposedly at some point in their history their family was linked with brewing. And also a famous example is Smith, blacksmithery, being a blacksmith. Often that's where that name comes from. There's also locational names, and these are actually some of the oldest surnames per se, as opposed to being patronyms. And these names are linked with a certain place. And actually, my name or my surname, Astles, A-S-T-L-E-S, is a locational name. It's actually it's also a compound name. It's two words which have been squashed together, East and Hull, or Eastern Hill, which have become Astles. Out comes this name. It's one of the oldest surnames, in Britain, and I'm quite proud of that. But also, we'll come back to this in a moment. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have a particular line back into that part of the past, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So anyway, locational names are fairly old, and often they're linked with, for example, woods or towns or hills, this kind of thing. In fact, they're some of the oldest which were formed. Also, occasionally nicknames will lead to someone's surname. For example, Small, describing as person of slender build, which becomes a family name. However, there are traps here, and actually throughout all of this, in terms of you must be aware of linguistic origins as well as meaning origins. For example, Doolittle, people often think that Doolittle is a name linked with a very lazy person who did very little. But actually no, it's more likely to come from an Irish origin. For example, Dublin, meaning, I think, black pool, I seem to recall, in Irish, is the dub bit, or the dove, actually is probably the origin of the do in Doolittle, so black something, and probably the little is an anglicisation of an Irish first name, probably. So black something in Doolittle, more likely than not. And also there's political shifts, and again an excellent example of this would be the Norman conquest of Britain. Saxon first names became rather unpopular. It pointed you out as not being of the ruling class, and often they shifted into being surnames, and often these surnames were linked with, for example, Saxon ways of referring to God. So Oslaf, Oslak, Oswald, Oswin, Osway, Os meaning God. And so political expediency can actually shift what your name is as well, and form what you're willing to call yourself. Now, to get on to answering your question with regards to your friend whose surname is Borg, unfortunately, I'm sorry to have to say, it's unlikely that this name comes directly from a Viking family, as it were. The reason for this is that the Vikings didn't really have surnames as we understand them. They had patronyms and also rarely matronyms. So an excellent example would be Skallagrimsson, the son of Skallagrim. And this is actually a tradition which is still proudly held in Iceland, patronymic, and indeed the laws surrounding what you can call your children. Recently there was a court case where a girl who had a name which could be perceived as being masculine had to fight for her name because of the laws which dictate what you can and can't call your children. But this is because they held very tightly to their proud patronymic tradition. Whereas Borg isn't a patronym. Borg is, you're quite right, or rather he is quite right, it is quite possibly an Old Norse word, but more than that, it's also linked with Old English and a broader Old German or Germanic sort of root, and it means castle, or sort of later on it means sort of mountain hilltop fortress kind of thing. Borg, from a quick Google search actually, has its links primarily with areas such as Britain, yes, Sweden certainly, Malta, France, Quebec. And therefore it could have come from any one of these different areas. Now, if he happens to have a more recent Swedish familial connection that he's aware of, then it probably is a Swedish name. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a Viking name. In particular, because the Swedish Vikings were famous for having headed east, as it were, not necessarily for having settled a long time ago in Britain. So it depends on how far he can trace his name back and for what purposes, and how the name is linked in with family and this kind of thing. Now, topographical surnames, such as Borg, were amongst the earliest created, but crucially they were demonstrably created around about the 1300s or thereabouts. And especially in Sweden, actually, the oldest surnames are linked with patronyms. And then over time, more aspirational folk started to create surnames which were linked with places, such as, for example, Borg and this kind of thing. So it may well be a more complicated relationship with his past than one thinks. Now, surnames do change as well. It's worthwhile bearing that in mind. Migration, marriage, wanting to hide or change one's identity, political incentives, as I say, with the Norman invasion of Britain, there was an awful lot of incentive there to change names. And of course, more recently, for example, there were countless people in Britain, in America, so on and so forth, who had a German-sounding name, who changed it fairly rapidly in the middle of the 20th century. We all know why. And so therefore, these changes can't necessarily be easily traced, especially in the early times of surnames. So again, it's very difficult to link a name with genes. So Borg, unfortunately, is probably not an indication of Viking blood per se, but it is probably an indication of some sort of Swedish or German or Germanic connection, possibly English, and therefore it warrants further investigation. Now, it's really hard. This is probably the end. Towards the end of this video, I really want to highlight. It's really difficult to stop thinking in terms of lines when it comes to family. We all tend to think in that sort of patronymic kind of way. My father's 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 father, and this kind of thing. Especially in terms of stock. This idea of Viking stock. But cultures do come and go, and genes flow through them. The Vikings, before they were Vikings, were something else. And yes, I can understand the need and the desire to be linked with Vikings, but they didn't have Viking genes. They had genes from elsewhere which, yes, settled in probably Scandinavia for a while, went elsewhere in the world, Britain, North America, all the way around into the Mediterranean, Constantinople. And therefore, yes, they can be traced, but there's no pure Vikingness out there, and that's something which is really crucial to get down to. Identity and genes are two very different things. For example, we don't live in a world kind of like Conan the Barbarian, where there are Atlanteans or Chimerians and this kind of thing. We quite rightly are actually far more connected than we often think. And indeed, it's very hard for us to separate out the idea of a single line from the fact actually that we are in fact very much connected. Now, an excellent way of doing this, or illustrating this, is to look at how many ancestors do we have when we go back to that time. I did some maths this morning, and when you go back 30 generations, I'm calculating roughly 30 generations to the Norman Conquest, 1066, one has roughly 1 billion ancestors, 1.1 billion or thereabouts. Now, this is in a time when the world population is estimated to have been around about 250-300 million. Now, what that means is that you have 1.1 billion connections in your family tree that far back, but people are probably doubling, tripling up, as it were, in those family trees. In other words, we're actually all related in a funny sort of way. So, I suppose what I'd like to try and do is not end on a downer. Certainly, Borg warrants more research, absolutely, and he may well find that it is directly a Swedish connection, and perhaps beyond that, maybe there's some documents showing that someone formed that name having lived there for a long time. But again, the concept of Sweden and the concept of being a Viking are not necessarily the same thing, and the concept or rather the surname Borg, could have come from through France, could have come through Malta, could have come through England, through Germany. There's many different origins to that surname. But what I would say is that you should take heart in the fact that certainly, yes, you have access to the idea of having come from a Viking origin, but also as well that you are related to everyone else as well. You are a human being, and that is reassuring, is it not? However, I am willing to concede at the end of this video that just like the Borg themselves, the idea of thinking in straight lines, my father's father, father, rather than having a web of connectedness, is it's very hard to resist. Indeed, as the Borg may say, resistance is futile. So, thank you, Mandy, for asking the question. Your friend Borg may be a Viking or may not be, but is almost certainly a human being and therefore related to, almost everyone else on the planet. Thank you so much for asking the question. And as I say, I do know that these issues are often very emotive and very hard for people to separate out. Family histories do have value. I'm not saying that they're not important. There are people who can trace their family line back to the very beginnings of surnames, for example, in Britain. I happen to have a colleague who can trace his family line all the way back to 1066 and a little bit beyond that. But beyond that, unfortunately, it's very hard to do. And most of us, myself included, have surnames which were demonstrably created. I personally take stock from this. It means that I'm a proud Welshman who has an Anglo-Saxon surname, and in that world, in that very beginning, little one step into that world, I already have a fairly varied background. And the more steps I take, the further and broader and more fascinating my background becomes. So, yes, take stock. Take stock in the fact that we're not simple things, we're not simple beings. Anyway, thanks again for asking the question, Mandy. Please do comment below, those of you who have any thoughts or feelings on this issue, and please try to be civil. As I say, if you are remotely offended by the idea that you are not just, from one particular origin, please don't comment at all, because I'm not trying to offend you. I'm simply trying to discuss the issues, as hopefully people will do below. Anyway, once again, thanks for asking the question, and until next time, bye-bye.